The kitchen counter still held traces of flour from the morning's bread, white dust catching the afternoon light that filtered through the curtains Sarah hadn't replaced in 8 years. She stood with her hands submerged in dishwater that had gone lukewarm, staring at the calendar on the wall where Thursday's date was circled in red ink. Her daughter's graduation, the university ceremony she'd be attending alone because Michael had a conference and Emma had a shift at the hospital, she couldn't miss. Sarah dried her hands on a towel that had once been white, now a muted grey despite her best efforts. 47 years old, and the most significant event on her calendar was someone else's achievement. She caught her reflection in the window above the sink, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when she'd made the decision, when she'd sat in Professor Harmon's office and explained that she couldn't continue her doctorate in molecular biology. That was 23 years ago, when Emma was 2 and Ryan was still in diapers, and her husband Michael had looked at her with something between relief and disappointment. The dissertation sat in a box in the attic, 3 years of research on gene therapy applications, pages yellowing now, findings that someone else had probably published by now under their own name. She'd been so close. Harmon had called her work groundbreaking, had fought to keep her in the program, had offered extensions and accommodations, but Michael worked 60-hour weeks at the firm, and her mother had just been diagnosed, and Emma had started having night terrors that only Sarah could soothe. She walked to the living room where photographs lined the mantel in mismatched frames. Emma in her white coat, already a resident. Ryan with his engineering degree working on sustainable infrastructure in developing countries. Michael in his corner office, partner at 39, everything he'd worked for. And Sarah in every picture, standing slightly to the side, smiling but somehow separate, as if she existed in the margins of everyone else's story. The mailbox creaked when she opened it, a sound she'd been meaning to have Michael fix for months. Between the grocery store circulars and a water bill, there was a thick envelope from the university. She almost threw it away, assuming it was another alumni donation request, but something about the weight made her pause. Inside, an invitation to a symposium on gene therapy advancements, hosted by the Medical Research Department. Her name was on the list of former doctoral candidates being honored for their contributions to early research in the field. Sarah sat on the porch steps, the envelope trembling slightly in her hands. Contributions. The word felt hollow. She'd contributed nothing. She'd left before completing anything meaningful, her research absorbed into someone else's work, her name relegated to acknowledgement sections she'd never seen. The symposium was in 3 weeks, the same weekend as Emma's graduation party they'd been planning for months. That evening she burned the chicken. Michael ate it without comment, scrolling through his phone between bites. Emma called during dinner, excited about a complex surgery she'd observed, her voice animated in a way that made Sarah's chest tighten with something that wasn't quite pride, wasn't quite envy. After Michael went to bed, she sat alone in the kitchen with a glass of wine she didn't really want, the symposium invitation spread on the table before her. She remembered the moment she'd made the choice, sitting in their old apartment with bills spread across the coffee table, Emma crying in the next room, Michael offering to quit his job so she could finish. But his firm was solid, and her stipend barely covered daycare, and her mother needed someone, and the practical choice had seemed so obvious. Everyone had agreed it made sense. Even Harmon, disappointed as he was, had understood. Sometimes sacrifice was necessary. Sometimes you had to choose. But no one had asked what it would feel like 23 years later, to realize you'd spent more than 2 decades living in the wake of that single decision, watching it ripple forward into a life you hadn't quite imagined for yourself. No one had warned her about the particular emptiness of being proud of your children while simultaneously wondering who you might have become. Sarah pulled out her laptop, something she rarely did after dinner, and searched for her old research. It took nearly an hour of digging through university archives and old databases, but she found it, reference notes in a 2008 paper on viral vector modifications, her name in small print among half a dozen others who'd contributed preliminary data. That was it. 3 years of her life reduced to a footnote. She closed the laptop harder than she intended, the sound sharp in the quiet house. Through the window she could see the neighbor's light still on. Mrs. Chen, who'd taught piano for 40 years and never married, never had children, who still played every evening, her music drifting through the street. Sarah had always felt a kind of pity for her, that solitary life. Now she wondered if Mrs. Chen ever stood at her window and felt the same about Sarah's crowded, dutiful existence. The symposium invitation went into the drawer with the bills and emergency contacts and expired coupons, things she meant to deal with later but probably never would. She had a graduation to attend, a party to plan, a life to maintain. That other path, the one she'd abandoned, was closed now, overgrown with years of different choices. There was no point in looking back at roads not taken when you were already this far down the one you'd chosen. The graduation ceremony was longer than Sarah had expected. Hundreds of names called in alphabetical order, while she sat in uncomfortable auditorium seating that made her back ache. She'd worn the blue dress Michael liked, the one that made her look put together, even though she'd bought it 6 years ago and the hem was starting to fray. Around her, families erupted in cheers for their graduates, while she clapped politely, saving her energy for when they called Emma's name. When it came, she stood and shouted louder than she'd intended, something breaking open in her chest as she watched her daughter walk across that stage. Emma had worked so hard, overnight shifts and endless studying, the kind of dedication Sarah recognized because she'd once had it herself. After the ceremony, in the crowd of embracing families, Emma found her and hugged her so tightly, Sarah's ribs hurt. "I couldn't have done this without you, Mom." The words should have felt like enough. They didn't, and Sarah hated herself a little for that. The party was in their backyard. String lights Michael had hung that morning, casting everything in a warm glow that felt almost theatrical. Neighbors came, friends from Emma's childhood, colleagues from the hospital. Sarah moved through the crowd with practiced ease, refilling drinks, bringing out more food, accepting compliments on how wonderful her daughter was, how proud she must be. Everyone wanted to talk to Emma, to hear about her residency, her plans. No one asked Sarah about herself, and why would they? She'd long ago become the kind of person whose identity was entirely derivative, existing only in relation to other people's accomplishments. She was in the kitchen, alone for a moment, when Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway holding an empty glass. "Quite a celebration," Sarah smiled, the automatic expression she'd perfected. "Emma's worked so hard for this. And you?" Mrs. Chen's voice was gentle but direct in a way that caught Sarah off guard. "What did you work hard for?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah busied herself with opening a new bottle of wine, her hands suddenly clumsy. "I have a wonderful family. 2 kids who are making a difference in the world. That's more than enough." "Is it?" Sarah looked up sharply, but there was no judgment in Mrs. Chen's expression, only a quiet understanding that made Sarah's throat tighten. She'd known this woman for 15 years, exchanged pleasantries over the fence, but they'd never had a conversation like this, had never spoken about anything real. "I had a chance once," Sarah heard herself say, "to do something important, research that might have mattered." "Might have?" "I gave it up. For them." She gestured toward the window, toward the yard full of people celebrating Emma. Mrs. Chen was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "I never had children. People always assumed it was because I was too focused on my music, or too selfish, or too something. The truth is simpler than that. I was afraid of that exact choice, afraid I'd resent them for what I gave up, or resent myself for what I didn't give them." Sarah's eyes burned. She blinked hard, refusing to cry at her daughter's party. "It's not resentment. I love them. I'm proud of them." Those things can both be true, love and loss. They're not mutually exclusive. Before Sarah could respond, Michael appeared in the doorway, slightly drunk and jovial, pulling her back to the party, to the role she played so well. The moment dissolved, but Mrs. Chen's words followed her through the rest of the evening, through the toasts and the laughter and the inevitable cleanup after everyone had gone. That night, unable to sleep, Sarah found herself in the attic, searching for the box with her dissertation. It was wedged behind Christmas decorations and old toys she couldn't bring herself to donate. The cardboard was soft with age, damp from years of temperature fluctuations. She carried it downstairs and spread the pages across the dining room table, reading by the light of a single lamp. The work was good. Even now, reading it with 2 decades of distance, she could see the potential in it, the questions she'd been asking that had led to larger breakthroughs in the field. If she'd continued, if she'd finished, she might have been part of something significant. She might have been someone significant, not just someone's mother, someone's wife, but Sarah, a name attached to discoveries, to progress. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Thank you for everything, Mum. You sacrificed so much for us and I'll never forget that." Sacrificed. There was that word again, worn smooth from overuse, meant to sound noble but feeling more like erasure. She'd sacrificed, yes, but no one ever talked about what happened to the person doing the sacrificing, how you could give away so much of yourself that one day you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize who was looking back. Sarah picked up her phone and typed a response. "I love you, sweetheart. So proud of you." Then deleted it and typed again. "Thank you for saying that. I'm proud of the woman you've become." She hit send before she could overthink it, then sat staring at the pages of her abandoned research, wondering what exactly she'd been trying to prove by digging them out. That she'd once been someone? That she'd had potential? That the choice had cost her something real? The symposium invitation was still in the drawer. She retrieved it, reading through the schedule, seeing names she recognized, people she'd worked alongside who'd continued while she'd stopped. There would be presentations on advancements in gene therapy, discussions of applications she'd once dreamed of contributing to, and her name, listed among the early researchers, a footnote being honored. She should throw it away. She should focus on the life she had, the family she'd built, the choices she'd made and couldn't unmake. But instead, she found herself opening her laptop and registering for the symposium, her fingers moving before her mind could catch up with what she was doing. It was the same weekend as Emma's party, yes, but the party could be moved, or she could miss a few hours, or perhaps Michael could handle it alone. She deserved this one small thing, this one acknowledgement that she'd once been more than just a mother, just a wife, just someone in the background of everyone else's photographs. When she finally went to bed, Michael was snoring softly, completely unaware that anything had shifted. Sarah lay in the dark, her heart beating faster than it should, feeling both terrified and more alive than she had in years. The symposium registration confirmation arrived 2 days later, clinical and impersonal, just a ticket and a schedule. Sarah printed it and hid it between cookbooks she never used, as if the information might somehow expose itself to Michael if left out in the open. She hadn't told him yet. Hadn't told anyone. The decision felt both monumental and embarrassingly small, like she was sneaking away to something she had no right to attend. Emma called that evening, her voice tight with exhaustion from a double shift. "Mom, I know this is last minute, but could we maybe move the party? The hospital needs me to cover next weekend and I really can't say no." Sarah's breath caught. The universe, it seemed, made decisions for you when you were too afraid to make them yourself. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll reschedule. When works for you?" They settled on a date 3 weeks out, Emma apologizing profusely, while Sarah reassured her it was fine. Everything was fine. When she hung up, she sat very still, processing what this meant. She could go to the symposium. She could walk into that auditorium and see the work that had continued without her, could stand in a room with people who'd chosen differently, who'd finished what they'd started. The week before the symposium, Sarah drove to the university for the first time in over 2 decades. The campus had changed. New buildings, renovated walkways, students who looked impossibly young, moving between classes. But the science building was the same, that particular brick and glass structure, where she'd spent so many late nights hunched over lab equipment, believing she was on the verge of something important. She didn't go inside, just sat in her car in the parking lot, watching people come and go, trying to reconcile the person she'd been with the person she was now. A student passed by her window, laughing into her phone, backpack slung over one shoulder, completely unconcerned with the weight of choices not yet made. Sarah envied her that lightness, that freedom from knowing what roads untaken might have led to. The day of the symposium, Sarah told Michael she was having lunch with an old friend, which wasn't exactly a lie if you considered her former self someone she used to know. He barely looked up from his tablet, consumed with work emails that apparently couldn't wait until Monday. She drove the 40 minutes to the university conference center, with her hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, her stomach knotted with something between anticipation and dread. The registration table was staffed by graduate students who smiled professionally and handed her a name tag and program without recognition. She was just another attendee, anonymous in a crowd of researchers and academics. The main auditorium was filling up, people greeting each other with the easy familiarity of colleagues who saw each other at conferences throughout the year. Sarah found a seat in the middle section. Not too close, not too far back, the exact spot someone who didn't quite belong would choose. The keynote speaker was Dr. Patricia Vance, someone Sarah vaguely remembered from journal publications. She spoke about the evolution of gene therapy over the past 2 decades, about breakthroughs and setbacks, about the painstaking work of turning theoretical research into practical applications. Sarah listened, her initial nervousness giving way to something deeper, a recognition of the language, the methodology, the questions being asked. She'd been part of this once. She'd understood this world. Then, Dr. Vance clicked to a slide that made Sarah's heart stop. It was a timeline of key research developments, and there, in a small box dated 1999 to 2002, was Sarah's name. Not in the footnotes, not as a minor contributor, but highlighted as one of the foundational researchers whose early work on viral vector stability had been critical to later breakthroughs. The slide showed how her preliminary findings had been incorporated into protocols that were now standard practice, how her questions about immune response modification had opened entire avenues of investigation. Dr. Vance was talking, explaining how sometimes the most important work happens in those early stages, when researchers are asking the right questions even if they don't get to see the answers. She mentioned Sarah specifically, noting that while she'd left the program, her work had been preserved and built upon, that her contributions had quite literally saved lives through treatments now in use for previously untreatable genetic disorders. Sarah couldn't breathe. The room felt too small, too warm. People around her were taking notes, nodding along, completely unaware that the person being discussed was sitting 3 rows from the front, trying not to fall apart. Her work hadn't disappeared. It hadn't been meaningless. It had mattered. She had mattered. During the break, she stood in the hallway in a daze, holding a cup of coffee she didn't remember getting. That's when she saw him, Professor Harmon, older now, his hair completely white, but still with that same intense focus she remembered. My God, Sarah. His recognition broke something open in her. Professor Harmon. I saw your name on the attendance list and I couldn't believe it. How long has it been? 20 years? 23. He studied her face with the same careful attention he'd once given her research. Did you hear the keynote? Patricia highlighted your work specifically. I heard. Her voice was barely steady. You should be proud. Your research on vector stability, we built entire treatment protocols on that foundation. There are people alive today because of questions you asked in that lab. Sarah's vision blurred. I left. I never finished. You didn't have to finish. The work you did was enough. He paused, seeming to measure his next words carefully. I always wondered what happened to you. Wondered if you were happy with your choice. I have 2 children, both doing remarkable things, a daughter who's a doctor, a son who's an engineer. That's wonderful. His tone was genuine, but there was a question underneath it he was too kind to ask. I thought I'd given it all up for nothing, Sarah said quietly. I thought I'd just disappeared, that none of it mattered. Harmon shook his head. That's not how science works. We build on each other. You laid bricks in a foundation that hundreds of researchers have built upon. Your work is in every treatment protocol we use today. You just weren't there to see the building rise. Someone called his name, a colleague waiting to discuss something. Before he left, he touched her shoulder briefly. I'm glad you came. I hope you stay for the afternoon sessions. There's a panel on future applications that I think you'd find fascinating. Some of your old questions are finally getting answered. Sarah stood alone in that hallway, people flowing around her, and felt something shift in her chest. For 23 years, she'd carried the weight of that choice like a stone, like something that had broken her, diminished her, turned her into less than she might have been. But maybe it hadn't. Maybe she'd been living in a story she'd told herself about sacrifice and loss and disappearing, when the truth was more complex than that. She stayed for the afternoon sessions, listened to presentations on gene therapies now in clinical trials, treatments for diseases that had been death sentences when she'd been in that lab. She heard her name mentioned twice more, always in the context of foundational work, early research that had pointed the way forward, and she realized, sitting in that auditorium, that she'd never actually disappeared. She'd just changed form, her contributions living on in ways she'd never known to look for. Sarah sat in her car in the university parking lot for nearly an hour after the symposium ended, unable to drive, unable to process what she'd learned. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the windshield, and she kept thinking about that slide with her name on it, the casual way Dr. Vance had referenced her work as if it was simply a given fact, not a revelation that shattered 23 years of Sarah's understanding of her own life. People alive today because of questions she'd asked. Harmon had said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, as if it was obvious. But it wasn't obvious to her. For more than 2 decades, she'd believed her choice to leave had erased her, had turned her into nothing more than a supporting character in other people's stories. She'd worn that narrative like a heavy coat, so used to its weight she'd forgotten she was carrying it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Michael. "Working late. Don't wait up for dinner." She stared at the message, trying to reconcile the life she'd been living with, the one she was beginning to see more clearly. Michael, who rarely asked about her day, who'd long ago stopped seeing her as anything other than the person who managed the household, who kept things running smoothly so he could focus on his career. Had he known all these years that she'd given up something significant? Or had he, like her, accepted the story that her choice had been practical, necessary, ultimately inconsequential beyond its impact on the family? She drove home in the dark, the roads familiar enough that her hands moved on autopilot while her mind spun. The house was empty when she arrived, Michael still at the office, Emma working another night shift, Ryan overseas on his infrastructure project. She walked through rooms that suddenly felt like a museum of choices she'd made. The furniture they'd picked together when money was tight, the photographs documenting years of school plays and soccer games and graduations, the kitchen where she'd made thousands of meals, the bed where she'd comforted crying children through nightmares and heartbreaks. All of it real, all of it valuable. And yet, she found the box from the attic still sitting on the dining room table where she'd left it days ago, her dissertation pages spread out like evidence in an investigation. She looked at them differently now, not as relics of a lost future, but as artifacts of work that had mattered, that had continued mattering even in her absence. Harmon had been right. She hadn't needed to finish to contribute. The questions she'd asked had been enough. But that understanding brought a new, more complicated grief. If her work had mattered, if she hadn't disappeared, then what exactly had she been mourning all these years? What had she been punishing herself for with every self-effacing comment about being just a mum, every time she'd downplayed her past accomplishments, every moment she'd felt like a ghost at the edges of her own life? She thought about Emma's text, thanking her for sacrificing so much. How many times had she heard variations of that sentiment, from her children, from Michael, from friends and family who saw her choice as noble, selfless, right, and she'd accepted their narrative because it made the pain make sense. If she'd given up something precious, then the sacrifice itself became meaningful, became the story of who she was. But what if she hadn't actually sacrificed as much as she'd thought? What if the work had continued without her, and her children had grown up whole and loved, and both things were true simultaneously? What if she'd been living inside a false choice, believing she had to be either the researcher or the mother, when in fact she'd been both all along, just in ways she hadn't known how to recognize? Sarah opened her laptop and began searching for more information. She found her name in acknowledgement sections of dozens of papers published over the years, found citations of her preliminary work, found references to methodologies she'd developed being used in labs around the world. The evidence was there, had always been there. She'd just never looked for it, too busy grieving what she'd thought she'd lost, to notice what had actually remained. At midnight, when Michael finally came home, she was still sitting at the dining room table surrounded by printouts and papers. He paused in the doorway, loosening his tie, looking confused. What's all this? My research, from before. He moved closer, picking up one of the papers, skimming it without comprehension. Why are you looking at this now? I went to a symposium today, at the university. Something shifted in his expression, not quite guilt, not quite discomfort, but close to both. You said you were having lunch with a friend. I lied. The admission felt surprisingly easy. I wanted to see what happened to my work after I left. Michael set down the paper carefully, as if it might break. Sarah, we've been over this. You made the right choice back then. The family needed you. Did we? The question surprised them both. Or did I just accept that I was the one who had to give things up because it was easier than questioning whether that was actually true? That's not fair. You knew what you were doing when I knew what everyone told me I should do. Be practical, be responsible, put the family first. And I did. I don't regret that. She paused, trying to find words for something she was only beginning to understand herself. But what I learned today is that I didn't actually give it up. My work continued. It saved lives, Michael. Real people are alive today because of research I started and never finished. He sat down heavily in the chair across from her, his face unreadable. So what are you saying? That you want to go back, after all these years? I don't know what I'm saying. I just know that I've spent 23 years believing I erased myself, that my choice turned me into less than I was. And today I found out that wasn't true. I'm trying to figure out what to do with that information. The silence between them stretched out, filling with all the things they'd never said to each other over 2 decades of marriage. How he'd let her sacrifice because it was convenient for him, how she'd resented him for it while never saying so, how they'd built a life on an unspoken agreement that her dreams were less important than his comfort, than the family's stability, than everything else. I should have fought for you, Michael said finally, his voice rough. Back then, I should have insisted we find another way. Would you have actually quit your job if I'd asked? He didn't answer, and his silence was its own admission. Sarah felt something break open in her chest, but it wasn't the sharp pain she'd expected. It was softer than that, sadder, but also clearer. I need you to understand something. I love our children. I'm proud of the life we built. But I also need you to see that I gave up something real, something that mattered. And for 23 years, no one, including you, has acknowledged that. Everyone just keeps saying how noble it was, how right I was to sacrifice, as if my work was expendable as long as the family was okay. What do you want me to say? I want you to say it wasn't fair. I want you to admit that I paid a price for our life together, and that price was real, and it hurt me in ways no one bothered to notice because I was so good at pretending it didn't. Michael's eyes were wet, which shocked her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen him cry. It wasn't fair, you're right, and I'm sorry I never said that before. The apology didn't fix anything, but it loosened something that had been wound tight in Sarah's chest for years. They sat together in that cluttered dining room. The evidence of her abandoned career spread between them, and for the first time in their marriage, she felt like he was actually seeing her, not as his wife, not as the children's mother, but as Sarah, a person who'd had potential and dreams and had paid real costs for the life they'd chosen together. 2 weeks later, Sarah attended Emma's rescheduled graduation party with a different feeling in her chest than she'd had at the first one. She moved through the crowd with the same efficiency, making sure everyone had drinks and food. But this time she noticed something she'd missed before, how Emma kept pulling her into conversations, introducing her not just as my mom, but as my mom who used to do genetic research. How Ryan, home for the party, told his friends about finding his mother's old dissertation and being amazed by it. Her children knew. They'd always known. She'd just never heard them say it because she'd been so focused on her own narrative of disappearance that she'd missed how they actually saw her. After most of the guests had left and they were cleaning up, Emma pulled her aside. "Mum, I need to tell you something. When I was deciding whether to go into medicine, I read your research. I found it in the attic when I was home from college one year." Sarah went still. "You never said anything. You seemed like you didn't want to talk about it." Like it hurt too much. Emma twisted a dish towel in her hands. But reading your work, seeing the questions you were asking, the way you approached problems, that's what made me want to be a doctor. Not just to help people, but to ask the right questions about how to help them better. The words hit Sarah like a physical thing. She thought she'd given up research to raise her children. But her children had grown up shaped by her work anyway, had internalized the way she thought about the world, had become the kinds of people who asked important questions because they'd learned from her how to do that. "I never knew," Sarah said quietly. "I know. And I'm sorry I never told you. I thought you wanted to move on from that part of your life." Emma's eyes were bright. "But that text I sent, about how you sacrificed for us, I didn't mean you gave up who you were, I meant you gave us yourself, and that included the parts of you that were a brilliant researcher. We got to grow up with someone who taught us how to think critically, how to approach problems systematically, how to care about work that matters. You didn't leave that behind. You just gave it to us differently." Sarah couldn't speak. She pulled her daughter into a hug and held on tightly, feeling something fundamental shift in how she understood the past 23 years. She hadn't erased herself. She just changed what form her contribution took. Her work had continued in laboratories she never entered, and also in the minds of her children, who'd learned from her how to approach the world with curiosity and rigor. The following week, Sarah received an email from Professor Harmon. He was organizing a panel discussion on the evolution of gene therapy research and wanted to know if she'd be willing to participate, to talk about the early days of the work and how the field had developed. It would be virtual, so she wouldn't need to travel. Just an hour of her time to share her perspective. She almost declined immediately, automatically thinking she had nothing valuable to contribute, that she'd been gone too long, that no one would care what she had to say. But then she stopped herself and read the email again, really paying attention to what Harmon was actually asking for. He wasn't inviting her as a courtesy or a favor. He wanted her perspective specifically, because she'd been there at the beginning and had seen the questions that had driven everything that came after. Sarah wrote back yes before she could talk herself out of it. The panel was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. She set up her laptop in the kitchen where the light was good, put on a nice shirt, and tried to calm the nervousness that made her hands shake. When the call connected and she saw the other panelists, all accomplished researchers, people with extensive publication records and prestigious positions, her first instinct was to feel inadequate, to wonder what she was doing there among people who'd finished what she'd only started. But then Harmon introduced her, talking about her foundational work on viral vector stability, and one of the other panelists mentioned that his current research had built directly on questions Sarah had posed in 2001, and suddenly she wasn't an imposter. She was part of a conversation that had been happening for decades, a conversation she'd helped start, even if she hadn't been there for the middle chapters. They asked her about the early challenges, about what questions had driven her research, about what it was like to work in a field that was so new and uncertain. Sarah answered, and found that she still knew this language, still understood this world. The years hadn't erased her knowledge. They'd just been overlaid with different experiences that gave her a different perspective. When she talked about having to leave the program, she didn't apologize or diminish it. She simply stated it as fact, and then talked about how her work had continued anyway, in ways she'd only recently discovered. After the panel ended, her inbox filled with messages from graduate students and early career researchers saying her story had resonated with them, that knowing someone could contribute meaningfully even without completing their degree or publishing extensively was encouraging. One message from a young mother struggling to balance research and childcare hit Sarah particularly hard. "Thank you for being honest about the costs of your choices, but also for showing that those choices didn't erase your impact. I needed to hear that today." Sarah responded to each message thoughtfully, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Useful. Not in the background support way she'd grown accustomed to, but directly, immediately useful in her own right. That evening, she sat on the porch with a glass of wine, watching Mrs. Chen through the window across the street, the older woman playing piano with the focused intensity that had marked her entire life. Mrs. Chen had chosen differently, had prioritized her art over family, and Sarah had once thought that made her lonely. But maybe it didn't. Maybe she was simply living a different version of a full life, one that had its own sacrifices and rewards. Sarah thought about the question Mrs. Chen had asked at Emma's party, "Is it enough?" For 23 years, Sarah had tried to convince herself that yes, her family was enough, that being proud of her children's accomplishments could fill the space where her own dreams had been. And in some ways it had been true. She loved her children profoundly, was genuinely proud of who they'd become, but she'd been asking the wrong question. It wasn't whether her family was enough. It was whether she could hold both truths simultaneously, that she'd given up something real and valuable, and that her choice had resulted in real and valuable outcomes, and that both things could exist together without one negating the other. She'd spent so long in binary thinking, believing she was either the researcher or the mother, either fulfilled or sacrificing, either mattering or disappearing. But life was more complicated than that. She'd been all of those things at once, and the grief she'd carried wasn't for a self that had died, but for a self she'd needed to integrate into who she was now, rather than keeping locked away in the attic with her old papers. Michael came outside and sat beside her, not saying anything at first, just being present in a way he hadn't been for years. They'd started talking differently since that night in the dining room, more honestly, acknowledging the unspoken costs of their life together. He was trying in his way to see her more clearly. "Emma told me what she said about your research," he offered quietly, "about how it influenced her." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "I've been thinking about something," Michael continued. "That university email you got about the symposium. There will be more of those, won't there? More chances to engage with your old work?" "Maybe. I don't know." "I think you should. Not because you need permission or because I'm granting it, but because you deserve to be more than what we needed you to be." The words were imperfect, still carrying echoes of old patterns, but they were honest. Sarah reached over and took his hand, and they sat like that in the cooling evening air. Two people who'd built a life together that had been beautiful and costly in ways they were only beginning to fully understand. The next morning, Sarah pulled out a notebook, one of the blank ones she'd bought years ago with vague intentions of journaling but had never used. She started writing, not about what she'd lost or what she'd gained, but about what she'd learned. About how contributions take different forms, about how impact isn't always visible or immediate, about how you can change the world and raise children, not because both are easy or because there's no cost, but because both are real and both matter. She wrote about the young mother who'd messaged her after the panel, about Emma reading her dissertation in the attic and finding direction, about Ryan learning from her how to approach complex problems. She wrote about treatments saving lives that incorporated research she'd started but never finished, about questions she'd asked that other people had spent decades answering. Most importantly, she wrote about the 23 years she'd spent believing in her own disappearance, and about the moment at the symposium when she'd discovered that she'd been there all along, just in a different form than she'd imagined. The story she'd been telling herself was wrong, not the part about sacrifice, that had been real, but the part about erasure, about becoming nothing, about mattering less. She'd mattered then, and she'd mattered continuously since, in ways that were sometimes visible and sometimes invisible, but always real. Her phone buzzed with another email. A research group working on pediatric applications of gene therapy wanted to interview her about her early work, about the questions that had driven her initial research. They'd seen her on the panel discussion and thought her perspective would be valuable for a paper they were writing about the field's evolution. Sarah read the email twice, then a third time, letting herself feel the small spark of excitement it created. She wasn't going back to research, wasn't going to pick up where she'd left off, as if the intervening years hadn't happened. That path was closed, not because she'd failed, but because she'd moved forward into a different life. But that didn't mean she had nothing to contribute now. It meant her contribution would take a different form, informed by everything she'd experienced and learned in the years since she'd left the lab. She wrote back and agreed to the interview. Then she added a line. "I should mention that while I was doing this research, I was also raising 2 small children and caring for an ill parent. That context shaped my work in ways I didn't fully understand at the time, but that I think are worth discussing as part of the broader conversation about how we support researchers with complex lives. She hit send before she could second-guess herself, before the old voice in her head could tell her that her personal struggles weren't relevant to scientific discussion. But they were relevant. The person asking the questions mattered as much as the questions themselves, and she'd spent too long pretending that the two were separate. That afternoon, she drove to the university again, this time walking into the science building, through halls that smelled of chemicals and ambition. She found her old lab, now occupied by different researchers working on different projects. She stood in the doorway watching them work, seeing herself in their focused intensity, their careful methodologies, their belief that what they were doing mattered. One of the grad students noticed her and came over, polite but curious. "Can I help you? I used to work here a long time ago." The student smiled. "Oh yeah? What were you researching?" "Viral vector stability for gene therapy applications." The student's eyes widened. "Wait, you're not... Are you Sarah Mitchell?" The recognition was startling. "I am. We still reference your work. Your protocols for immunogenic response testing are in our lab manual." He gestured excitedly to a shelf where thick binders held procedures and methodologies. "You're kind of a legend around here," Sarah laughed, the sound genuine and surprised. "A legend who left without finishing her degree." "Yeah, but you finished what mattered, the work itself." He paused, looking younger than Emma but with the same earnest dedication. "My professor always says the best researchers are the ones who ask questions that outlive them. You did that." She thanked him and left, but his words stayed with her as she drove home. Questions that outlived them. That's what she'd done, even if she hadn't known it, even through all the years she'd thought she'd disappeared. She'd asked the right questions and other people had carried them forward, and together, her and them, past and present, they'd built something that saved lives. Sarah pulled into her driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The house looked the same as always, but she saw it differently now, not as the place where she'd retreated from ambition, but as the place where she'd lived another kind of meaningful life, raising people who would go on to ask important questions themselves, who would approach the world with the same curiosity and rigor she'd once applied to her research. Both things were true, the sacrifice and the contribution, the loss and the impact, the grief and the pride. She didn't have to choose between them anymore, didn't have to pretend one negated the other. She could hold all of it. The complexity, the contradiction, the messy reality of a life fully lived, even when it hadn't turned out the way she'd planned. Inside, she found the symposium invitation she'd saved, now months old. She pinned it to the refrigerator, not hidden in a drawer but out in the open where she'd see it every day. A reminder not of what she'd given up, but of what she'd contributed, of who she'd been and who she still was. Of questions asked and lives saved and children raised and work that mattered, all of it real, all of it hers. Sarah stood in her kitchen, the afternoon light warm through the window, and felt something settle into place. Not happiness exactly, not closure or resolution, but something better. Acceptance. She'd made choices, and those choices had costs and consequences and outcomes that were sometimes visible and sometimes hidden. She'd lost things and gained things, and most importantly, she'd mattered. She'd always mattered, even when she couldn't see it. And that, finally, was enough.